Texas Panhandle, 1883. A dying man's fortune. A forgotten widow. And one apple pie that was about to change everything anyone thought they knew about power in Cedar Falls County, because when the richest man alive sits down at the poorest table in the room, somebody is always watching, and somebody is always afraid of what happens next. The harvest supper had been running for 1 hour before anyone noticed the silence at the far end of the last table. Long tables stretched across the church hall, draped in checkered cloth gone soft with washing, groaning under dishes carried in from every kitchen in the county. The air smelled of wood smoke and cinnamon and the particular sweetness of people who had survived a hard season and decided, together, to be grateful for it. Laughter rolled easy across the room. Children chased each other between chair legs. And at the head of it all walked Nathaniel Cross, 48 years old, the largest landholder in the county, a man so accustomed to being watched that rooms had long since stopped feeling like rooms to him and started feeling like stages. He rarely came to gatherings like this. Not from pride, but from a quieter discomfort, the exhaustion of a man who has never once, in a room full of people, been simply a man. Tonight he came because the Reverend had asked him personally, and because the money raised would keep the schoolhouse doors open through winter, and Nathaniel believed some things were worth the discomfort of being looked at. He filled his plate without ceremony, moving down the table the way a man moves through a chore. Then he reached the apple pie. He took a slice out of obligation. He took a bite out of habit. And then something in him went still. He set his fork down slowly, the way a man sets down something he is suddenly afraid to damage, and looked at that pie as though it had asked him a question he hadn't expected to answer. The room did not notice at first. Rooms rarely notice the moment before everything changes. He looked up. He looked down the long tables, past the pastries and the roasted hens and the pickled beets, and he asked, plainly, without performance, who made this? His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the voice of a man who had spent 30 years learning that when he asked a question, a room answered. And the room did shift, but not toward an answer. It shifted the way water shifts before it goes still. Because the women who had spent 3 days organizing this supper, the women whose names sat on every donation list and every church committee in Cedar Falls, exchanged a glance that carried something close to embarrassment. Not because they didn't know who had made the pie. Because they did. And the answer was sitting alone in a faded beige dress at the far end of the last table, a woman the whole town had quietly, collectively, decided to stop seeing. 4 seconds passed. 4 seconds that, in a hall of 60 people waiting on the most powerful man in the county, felt like the held breath before a storm finally breaks, because somebody was going to have to say her name, and nobody in that room had said it out loud in over a year. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and she was 29 years old, and for 2 years she had been the closest thing to a ghost that a living woman can become in a small town. Nobody had decided to erase her. That was the quiet cruelty of it, nobody had decided anything at all. It had simply happened, the way frost creeps into a house through gaps nobody bothered to seal. When her husband died and she did not weep where anyone could see it, did not ask for help, did not perform the grief the town expected of a widow, people had begun finding reasons not to meet her eyes on the boardwalk. It is far easier to look away from a woman than to admit you don't have the courage to walk toward her. Clara had come to Cedar Falls in 1879, a bride from Georgia with a recipe book and a husband named Joseph Whitmore, a steady, quiet man who worked 80 acres on the southern edge of town, land high enough in the plains that winter came hard and cold enough, it turned out, for a particular apple variety to fruit the way it was meant to. Joseph had planted that tree with his own hands the year they married. He worked that land honestly for 4 years. And then a fever took him in the autumn of 1881, and Clara did the one thing Cedar Falls had never quite forgiven her for. She stayed. Not the debt. Not the widowhood. The staying. There had been an unspoken expectation, never voiced, never written, simply understood, that a woman with no family in town and no husband in the ground beside his people would sell the land and go home. She had no home to go to. This was home now, whether Cedar Falls wanted her in it or not. So she worked that farm with 2 hired hands she could barely afford, made every payment to the lending office on the exact day it was due, and showed up to every gathering the town held, because showing up was the only door still open to belonging, and she intended to walk through it even if nobody held it for her. She had brought the apple pie because her mother had taught her, a lifetime ago in Georgia, that you bring something and you do not make a fuss about it. She had set it on the table without a word and taken her seat where the light was dimmest, where 30 minutes could pass without anyone's eyes finding her. She had done this for 2 years. She had gotten good at it. What she had not gotten good at, what nobody ever truly gets good at, was the sound of her own name spoken aloud in a silent room, waiting to be claimed. The silence broke, finally, because Clara Whitmore could not bear to let it stretch 1 second longer than dignity allowed. "I did," she said. No performance in it. No apology either. Just the plain, unadorned truth from a woman who had spent 2 years learning to say very little and mean all of it. Nathaniel Cross turned in his chair, and the whole room turned with him, 60 pairs of eyes swinging toward the far end of the last table like a compass needle finding north. Clara held his gaze the way a person holds still around something they haven't decided is safe yet. And then Nathaniel did something nobody in that hall expected, least of all Clara. He rose from his own seat near the head of the room, walked the length of 3 long tables, pulled out the chair across from her, and sat down as though it were the most natural act in the world. "This is the finest apple pie I've had in 20 years, he said. "I'd like to know how you make it." And he meant it. That was the part that undid her, not the compliment itself, but the plain, unguarded sincerity underneath it, the kind of meaning it that Cedar Falls had stopped offering her a long time ago. She told him about her mother's recipe, about the apples from the tree Joseph had planted their first year together, about grinding cinnamon fresh instead of pulling it from a tin gone stale on some shelf. Nathaniel asked about oven heat and sugar ratio, real questions, a cook's questions. "You cook," she said, surprised. "I did," he answered quietly. "Before. My wife was remarkable at it. I learned to pay attention." When Margaret Hale arrived at the table a few minutes later, brisk and efficient, asking whether Clara might help clear the dessert dishes once supper ended, Nathaniel answered before Clara could rise. "Mrs. Whitmore and I are in the middle of a conversation," he said, pleasant and immovable as stone. It was not a request. Margaret retreated. Clara sat back down, feeling something she hadn't felt in 2 years, the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being seen and not minded for it. They talked about Joseph for 20 minutes after that, and for the first time since his death, someone in Cedar Falls spoke of her husband as a man worth remembering rather than a name attached to an unpaid debt. Walking home beneath a sky so wide and star-scattered it seemed to press down on the flat dark land, Clara understood that something in her carefully guarded life had shifted. She did not yet know what it would cost her to find out. What Clara did not know, what she could not have known, sitting under those enormous Panhandle stars, was that her quiet, ordinary survival was, at that very moment, becoming somebody else's opportunity. Nathaniel rode past the Whitmore farm on his way home that night, telling himself he only wanted a look at the apple tree in the moonlight. A tree capable of producing fruit like that was worth knowing about, he reasoned, and there was truth enough in that reasoning to let him believe it. The farm sat modest and well-tended in the silver light, the house small but sound, the barn solid, the south pasture fenced tight with new-strung barbed wire, the kind of fencing that had been dividing the open range since the early 70s and had started range wars in counties less patient than this one. On a small, unprotected holding like Clara's, good fencing wasn't decoration. It was the only wall standing between her and every larger operation that would rather see her land folded quietly back into open range. He rode on, and the thought stayed with him longer than he expected. The next morning, he visited Harlan Briggs at the lending office, a cramped room of too many papers and too little light, run by a precise, careful man who had always struck Nathaniel as someone who understood, a little too well, the value of other people's desperation. He raised the Whitmore farm in passing, the way a man raises something he wants to seem unimportant. Harlan told him the truth without being asked twice, the note had started at $160, the balance now stood at $47, due whole on the 1st of December, and Clara had never once missed a payment in 4 years. Then Harland leaned forward, lowering his voice as though the papers on his desk might overhear. There had been an inquiry, he said. An investor, from outside the county, looking to purchase small notes just like hers. If she missed the deadline by even a single day once the note changed hands, the new holder could move to seize the land immediately, no public auction, no grace period, nothing but the letter of a transferred contract. Standard procedure, Harland said, spreading his hands as though the words themselves absolved him of something. Nathaniel asked who this investor was. Harland's eyes slid, just slightly, to the left. I'm not at liberty to say, he answered. Nathaniel said nothing further. He put on his hat, thanked Harland with a courtesy that gave away nothing, and walked out into the white autumn light. He sat on his horse outside that office for a long while, thinking about a woman who had gone unacknowledged for 2 years and an apple tree that needed cold winters to bear fruit and a debt of $47 standing between a widow and everything she had built with her own 2 hands. He was not yet certain what he intended to do about any of it. But he already knew, with the quiet certainty of a man who has spent his whole life reading rooms, that he was not going to simply ride away and let it happen. Nathaniel spent 2 days turning the problem over before he arrived at his answer, and the answer he chose said more about him than any speech could have. He would not pay the debt. Not because $47 meant anything to a man of his fortune, but because he understood, with a clarity most wealthy men never bother to earn, that paying it outright would be charity wearing the mask of kindness, and Clara Whitmore had spent 2 hard years proving she wanted no part of either, real or disguised. So instead, on a cold Thursday morning, he knocked on her door with no plan beyond an honest excuse. Clara answered with flour dusted across her hands and the composed, guarded look of a woman bracing for an interruption she hadn't asked for. "Mr. Cross," she said. "Mrs. Whitmore," he replied, "I've been thinking about that apple tree you mentioned. I've an east-facing section on my own land that might suit the variety. Would you show me?" It was, technically, true. It was also the thinnest reason a man of his standing had ever manufactured to knock on a widow's door, and something in her sharp, clear eyes told him she knew it. She let him around the side of the house anyway. They stood beneath the tree while she explained the grafting, the cold requirement, the timing of the harvest, and he listened with the full, undivided attention of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to actually listen to someone. Then he asked to see the fence line, claiming he needed a fencing man for his own north pasture and wanted to inspect the quality of hers first. The work was good, tight-strung wire, posts sunk to the correct depth, the unmistakable signature of someone who took pride in a job most men rushed. Pete Dawson did it, she told him, day work, when he can get it. "I'd like to hire him for 2 weeks on my property," Nathaniel said, "and I'd like to pay you a finder's fee for the recommendation." $5. Clara looked at him with open skepticism. "That is not how finder's fees work," she said. "I own considerably more land than most men," he answered, evenly, "and knowing which workers do honest labor is worth exactly that much to me." Then, because he could see the pride sitting stiff in her shoulders, he added, quieter, "I am not trying to rescue you, Mrs. Whitmore. I am trying to be useful in a way that costs you nothing you care about keeping." She held his gaze a long moment, weighing him the way she weighed every man who had ever tried to help her for reasons she didn't trust. $3, she said finally. "Agreed," he answered, and something close to a real smile broke across her face, unguarded, unplanned, the kind that changes a person's whole expression before they remember to catch it. He rode home thinking about that smile far longer than $3 had any right to earn. And 4 days later, when the answer came back from his lawyer in Amarillo confirming exactly who had made the inquiry to Harland Briggs, Nathaniel Cross realized the small, unhurried courtship he had just begun might be the only thing standing between Clara Whitmore and losing everything her husband had ever built, and he had until the 1st of December to decide exactly how far he was willing to go to stop it. If you were sitting at that harvest table tonight, would you have spoken her name sooner, or stayed silent like the rest of the room? Tell me in the comments. and if this story found you somewhere in the middle of your day, hit like, subscribe, and stay with us. Rose's story isn't over. December is coming, and so is the man who wants her land.